At 10:37 in the morning on Tuesday, August 18th, 2026, the ground beneath Granada, Spain, moved for the second time in less than a week. A magnitude 4.8 earthquake struck near the town of Gojar, just south of the city, sending residents and tourists alike running into the streets as pieces of masonry and roofing tiles fell from buildings around them. 3 people were injured, including a young girl taken to hospital for treatment. Emergency services fielded more than 50 calls reporting falling debris and cracked buildings. And in one of the more striking images of the day, officials evacuated part of the Alhambra, the centuries-old Moorish palace complex that is one of the most visited historic monuments in the entire country, as specialists rushed to inspect the site for structural damage. This wasn't the first earthquake to hit Granada this month. Just 3 days earlier, in the early hours of Saturday, August 15th, a nearly identical magnitude 4.8 earthquake struck the neighboring municipality of Alhendin, close enough to Tuesday's epicenter that seismologists are treating the two events as closely related. Aftershocks have continued rattling the region in the time between and since, including tremors reaching magnitude 4.0 and 4.2. Officials have been direct about what comes next. Further seismic activity remains possible. Today we're going to break down exactly what happened in Granada over these past several days, why southern Spain, a region most people don't automatically associate with serious earthquake risk, actually sits on top of a genuinely active and historically significant fault system, what's actually driving this specific cluster of activity, and what it means that a UNESCO World Heritage Site, nearly 1,000 years old, is now being inspected for earthquake damage. No exaggeration, no dramatizing, beyond what's already true. Just the facts, the geology, and the real stakes for a region that doesn't usually make international earthquake headlines. Before we get into it, I want to ask you something a little different today. If you've ever traveled somewhere you didn't expect to feel an earthquake, tell me about it in the comments. Because I think Granada is exactly that kind of place for a lot of people. A beautiful, historic destination that most visitors would never think to associate with active seismic risk. And if you want to stay ahead of every major geological story as it develops, subscribe to the channel. It's completely free, and it genuinely helps us keep making this kind of content. A thumbs up goes a long way too. And let's push this one to 6,000 likes so it reaches more people who need accurate information instead of a recycled panic clip. All right, let's get into it, and let's walk through the sequence carefully because the timing and location details here matter for understanding what's actually going on. The first earthquake struck at 1:04 a.m. local time on Saturday, August 15th, with Spain's National Geographic Institute, the country's official geological monitoring body known by its Spanish acronym IGN, placing the epicenter in the municipality of Alhendin in the province of Granada at a shallow depth of approximately 10 kilometers. The magnitude was recorded at 4.8, with the European Mediterranean Seismological Center briefly revising the number between 4.8 and 4.9 before settling on the official reading. The earthquake was assigned an intensity of IV to V on the scale used to describe how strongly shaking is actually experienced on the ground, and it was felt strongly not just in Granada itself, but across the neighboring province of Malaga, including in the city of Malaga. Then, 3 days later, at 10:37 a.m. on Tuesday, August 18th, a second magnitude 4.8 earthquake struck, this time centered near Gojar, a municipality sitting just south of Granada City, and close enough to Alhendin that seismologists studying the sequence view the two events as connected, part of the same broader burst of activity along this stretch of fault. The second earthquake was followed by several aftershocks in the surrounding municipalities, including tremors measuring around magnitude 4.0 and 4.2, a continuing pattern of activity that Andalusian officials have explicitly warned could continue. The human and structural impact of Tuesday's earthquake was immediate and visible. 3 people suffered injuries, described by Andalusian officials as minor, though one young girl required hospital treatment. Emergency services in the region received more than 50 separate calls reporting falling debris, cracked walls, and other damage across the Granada metropolitan area. Residents and tourists poured into the streets as the shaking hit, with pieces of masonry and roofing material falling in multiple locations. Granada's metro system responded by ordering trains to reduce speed to 30 kilometers per hour as a precaution, a small but telling detail that shows how quickly local infrastructure systems shifted into a heightened caution posture the moment the shaking was confirmed. Of everything that happened this week, the moment that's drawn the most international attention is what happened at the Alhambra, and it's worth explaining exactly why. The Alhambra is a sprawling palace and fortress complex built primarily during the Nasrid dynasty in the 13th and 14th centuries, one of the best preserved examples of Islamic architecture in the world, and consistently ranked among Spain's most visited monuments, drawing millions of tourists every year. When Tuesday's earthquake struck, officials moved quickly and evacuated two of the complex's most significant and architecturally sensitive sections, the Nasrid Palaces and the Alcazaba, the fortress portion of the site, as a precautionary measure while specialists inspected the centuries-old structures for any signs of earthquake damage. Notably, visits to two other sections of the complex, the General Life Gardens and the Partel area, were allowed to continue, suggesting officials were able to make a relatively quick, differentiated assessment of which parts of this sprawling, structurally varied site needed the most careful, immediate inspection. This detail is worth sitting with for a moment because it's a genuinely useful real-world illustration of a principle we've discussed before when covering earthquake risk in historic cities. A building's age and construction method matter enormously in determining its vulnerability to seismic shaking, and a complex like the Alhambra, built long before any concept of modern seismic engineering existed, represents exactly the kind of structure that requires careful, expert inspection after even a moderate earthquake. Not because moderate shaking is expected to cause catastrophic damage to a structure that has survived for roughly 700 years, but because centuries-old masonry, stone, and plasterwork can develop hidden structural weaknesses over time that even a professional eye needs a careful walkthrough to properly assess. If you've never associated southern Spain with earthquake risk, you're not alone, and it's worth explaining clearly why that gap in public awareness exists, and why the actual geological reality tells a different story. Southern Spain, and Granada specifically, sits within one of the most seismically active regions in all of Western Europe. The underlying cause traces back to the same broad tectonic story that shapes seismic risk across the entire Mediterranean, the ongoing slow-motion collision between the African plate and the Eurasian plate. As the African plate continues pushing northward into Eurasia, a process that's been unfolding over millions of years and continues today, the stress from that collision, it doesn't release in one single clean boundary the way it might along a more straightforward plate margin. Instead, it gets distributed across a complex fragmented network of smaller faults spanning southern Spain, the Alboran Sea, and northern Morocco, an area geologists refer to collectively as the Betic Rift orogenic system, or more simply, the Betic Cordillera, when referring specifically to the mountain range running through Granada, Malaga, and the wider Andalusian region. This region has a genuinely significant, well-documented history of destructive earthquakes, even though it doesn't produce them with anywhere near the frequency of somewhere like Japan or Indonesia. Spain's most destructive earthquake in living memory struck the town of Lorca in the neighboring region of Murcia in May 2011, a magnitude 5.1 earthquake that, despite its comparatively modest size, killed 9 people and caused widespread structural damage, largely due to its extremely shallow depth and its proximity to the town center. That disaster remains a significant reference point for Spanish seismologists and emergency planners precisely because it demonstrated how a moderate magnitude earthquake in this region, when shallow and close to a population center, can still produce serious, sometimes fatal, consequences. Going back further, this broader region has an even more significant historical record. The 1755 earthquake near Lisbon, Portugal, though centered further west along the same general tectonic boundary, remains one of the most catastrophic earthquakes in recorded European history, estimated at magnitude 8.5 to 9.0, and it triggered a devastating tsunami and fires that together killed tens of thousands of people across Portugal, Spain, and Morocco. That event, along with a long history of smaller but still significant earthquakes throughout southern Spain, is exactly why Spain's National Geographic Institute maintains a dense, continuously monitored seismic network across Andalusia, precisely because this region's relatively infrequent but genuinely real earthquake risk has been recognized and taken seriously by Spanish scientists for a very long time, even if it rarely reaches the international headlines the way Pacific Ring of Fire earthquakes do. It's worth explaining what it actually means, seismologically, for two earthquakes of nearly identical magnitude to strike such a tightly clustered area within such a short window. Because this is exactly the kind of pattern that determines how seriously local monitoring agencies treat an unfolding sequence. When multiple earthquakes of comparable size strike close together in both time and location, without one dramatically larger event clearly standing out as a main shock followed by smaller aftershocks, seismologists often classify that pattern as a swarm, the exact same terminology we've used before when discussing activity in California's Brawley seismic zone. A swarm doesn't necessarily indicate that a larger, more destructive earthquake is imminent. In many cases, including plenty of historical examples from seismically active regions worldwide, a swarm simply represents a temporary, localized release of accumulated stress across a cluster of small, interconnected faults, activity that gradually tapers off on its own without ever producing anything larger than the initial events. But a swarm also isn't something monitoring agencies simply dismiss. And that's exactly why Andalusian officials have been explicit in warning that further seismic activity remains possible following this week's second earthquake. The presence of multiple magnitude 4.0 plus aftershocks following Tuesday's event indicates the fault system in this specific area remains actively adjusting. And until that activity clearly tapers off over a sustained period, without any events approaching or exceeding the magnitude of the two main shocks already recorded, continued caution and close monitoring remain the responsible expected posture from Spain's seismic authorities. It's worth taking a moment to look at how quickly and effectively Spanish authorities responded to this week's earthquake, because it's a genuinely useful, real-time illustration of the kind of institutional preparedness we've discussed in the context of other countries throughout this year's coverage. Spain's National Geographic Institute operates a comprehensive seismic monitoring network across the country, capable of rapidly detecting, locating, and characterizing earthquakes within minutes, exactly the kind of infrastructure that allowed officials to confirm this week's epicenter location, depth, and magnitude so quickly after each event struck. Andalusia's regional emergency service, known as the 112 Emergency Agency, mirroring the standardized European emergency number, was able to begin fielding and coordinating response to dozens of individual damage reports within the immediate aftermath of Tuesday's earthquake, directing resources toward the areas reporting the most significant structural concerns. The response at the Alhambra specifically demonstrates a level of institutional readiness worth highlighting. Rather than either ignoring the earthquake's potential impact on a fragile, centuries-old structure or shutting the entire complex down indiscriminately, officials were able to conduct a targeted, differentiated assessment, evacuating the sections most likely to carry structural risk while allowing less vulnerable areas of the site to remain open to visitors. That kind of measured, informed response, executed within hours of a moderate earthquake, reflects real, practiced disaster protocols specifically tailored to the unique challenge of protecting historic architecture in an active, seismic zone. Protocols that likely exist precisely because Spain has had to think carefully about this exact scenario before, given the country's substantial inventory of centuries-old buildings sitting in regions with genuine, if infrequent, earthquake risk. Granada's metro system's decision to reduce train speeds following the earthquake is a smaller but similarly telling example of the same principle. An automatic, pre-established safety protocol activated the moment seismic activity was confirmed, rather than a reactive scramble improvised after the fact. If you live in Granada, Malaga, or the wider Andalusian region, or if you have travel plans there, here's what's actually useful right now, separate from the headline level alarm. The immediate, practical guidance from officials remains focused on continued vigilance rather than any specific evacuation order beyond the targeted precautionary measures already taken at the Alhambra. If you're in the region, it's worth knowing the basic earthquake safety fundamentals we've discussed throughout this year's coverage. Know how to drop, cover, and hold on if shaking begins. Know your building's most structurally sound interior spaces away from windows and heavy furniture that could fall, and understand that after any earthquake in the magnitude 4 to 5 range, aftershocks reaching similar magnitudes remain a realistic possibility for days afterward, exactly the pattern already playing out in Granada this week. If you have upcoming travel plans to Granada specifically, it's worth checking the Alhambra's official visitor information before your visit, since access to specific sections of the complex may continue to be adjusted as structural inspections proceed. This is a normal, responsible precaution rather than a sign of any long-term closure. And it's exactly the kind of measured, evolving response that reflects careful stewardship of an irreplaceable historic site, rather than genuine cause for canceling travel plans to the region entirely. There's a broader lesson worth drawing out here, one that connects directly to the theme running through nearly every story we've covered together this year. Earthquake risk isn't confined to the places that dominate global disaster headlines: Venezuela, Japan, Indonesia, California. It exists in varying degrees of frequency and severity across a much wider swath of the planet than most people's mental map of earthquake country actually includes. Southern Spain sits in exactly this kind of underappreciated risk zone, a region that experiences genuine, occasionally destructive seismic activity driven by real, understood tectonic forces, but rarely often enough, or severely enough, to embed the same kind of constant public seismic awareness you'd find in Japan or California. That gap between real, underlying risk and everyday public awareness is precisely why events like this week's Granada earthquakes deserve careful, accurate coverage rather than either dismissal because it's just Spain, not really earthquake country, or unwarranted alarm, treating a magnitude 4.8 swarm as some kind of unprecedented catastrophe. The truth, as it usually is in these stories, sits somewhere in the careful middle. This is a real, meaningful seismic event worth taking seriously. occurring in a region with a genuine, if often overlooked, history of exactly this kind of activity. Here's what's worth sitting with as we close this one out. Grenada has now experienced two nearly identical magnitude 4.8 earthquakes within the span of 3 days, part of an ongoing seismic swarm that officials say could continue producing further activity in the near term. 3 people have been injured, dozens of buildings have. Sustained damage significant enough to generate emergency calls, and one of Spain's most treasured historic monuments has had to undergo a careful, targeted structural inspection as a direct precaution. None of this places Grenada in the same category of catastrophic risk as the earthquake disasters we've covered this year in Venezuela, Colombia, or Indonesia. The magnitude here, at 4.8, sits in a genuinely different and far less inherently destructive range than the magnitude 7+ ruptures behind those disasters. But it is a real, current, actively unfolding seismic event in a part of the world most people don't associate with this kind of risk. And it's exactly the kind of story that rewards understanding the actual geology behind it, the Betic Cordillera, the ongoing African-Eurasian plate collision, and Spain's own significant, if underappreciated, earthquake history, rather, than either shrugging it off as a curiosity or treating it as something more alarming than the current data actually supports. We'll keep tracking this sequence closely, along with any further seismic activity across southern Spain in the days ahead, and any updates on the Alhambra's structural inspection. Subscribe so you don't miss any of it, and drop a comment letting me know if you've ever visited Grenada, or if this is the first time you're hearing that this beautiful, historic corner of Spain sits on genuinely active seismic ground. Let's get this one to 6,000 likes so it reaches people who want the accurate version of this story. Stay informed, and we'll see you in the next one.